At 2:37 p.m. on February 18, 2026, 10 F-16C Fighting Falcons from the 35th Fighter Squadron at Kunsan Air Base were doing what fighter pilots have done since 1946, flying in circles over the ocean, practicing the kind of basic combat maneuvers that every Air Force squadron runs thousands of times a year. The Wolfpack pilots were 93 nautical miles from the Chinese coast, in international airspace, executing a standard 4-ship versus 4-ship engagement that wouldn't have raised an eyebrow in any other corner of the planet. Then a Chinese radar operator looked at his screen, counted 10 F-16 where he was expecting to see 2, and made the kind of decision that gets civilizations into trouble. The Yellow Sea is roughly 236,000 square miles of shallow water, sandwiched between the Korean Peninsula and mainland China. About half of it falls inside competing air defense identification zones. The Korean KDIZ on one side, the Chinese ADIZ on the other, with a strip of overlap that international law treats as everyone's airspace and Beijing treats as its private swimming pool. The 35th Fighter Squadron had drifted exactly 12 nautical miles into that overlap zone. Less than a Brooklyn to Manhattan commute, in airspace where commercial 747s pass overhead twice an hour without anyone losing sleep.
But this was 2026, not 2006. And the Chinese leadership had spent the previous year watching American carrier groups, Marine expeditionary units, and stealth bombers show up in places that didn't exist on any People's Liberation Army training map. From the Caribbean to the Philippine Sea to the Eastern Mediterranean, the message had been the same. American military power, when it decided to actually show up, was still measured in geographies that Chinese planners had spent decades pretending didn't matter. So when the duty officer at Northern Theater Command Air Force in Shenyang saw 10 unidentified contacts crossing into the contested zone, he didn't ask what they were. He scrambled. At 2:42 p.m., the first pair of J-16 strike fighters lifted off from Anshan Air Base, clean except for 2 PL-15 long-range air-to-air missiles and 2 PL-10 close combat missiles each. Within 4 minutes, 6 more J-16s were airborne from secondary bases along the Bohai coast. By 2:50 p.m., the air picture over the central Yellow Sea included 16 Chinese fighters climbing hard to intercept 10 American jets that were, at that exact moment, completing turn rate drills. The Americans noticed. 80 miles east, an E-3 Sentry from the 961st Airborne Air Control Squadron, on station since dawn, watched the Chinese launch sequence unfold with the kind of clinical detachment that comes from having tracked exactly this profile in exactly this airspace several thousand times before. The senior weapons director keyed his radio. Pantons, Magic. Multiple bandits east of Dalian, climbing through Angels 20, heading 270. Count 16, repeat 16. Recommend you contract. The lieutenant colonel commanding the Wolfpack flight took about 2 seconds to think about it before he answered the way American fighter pilots have answered this exact question for 40 years. Magic, Pantons lead. Negative contract. We're in international airspace. Maintain current pattern. That was the moment the situation stopped being a training exercise and started being a problem. The technical mismatch was the kind of thing that should have given Chinese commanders pause before they bothered scrambling. The F-16C Block 50 carries the ANAPG E-3 Sabre active electronically scanned array radar, a system that can track a basketball-sized target at 75 nautical miles while simultaneously running ground mapping and electronic warfare functions. The J-16, despite its impressive paint job and propaganda coverage, runs an older Type 1493 radar with a fraction of the processing throughput. In a beyond visual range engagement, the gap between those two systems is the gap between fighting with night vision goggles and fighting with a flashlight. Add to this the fact that every single F-16 in the formation was tied into Link 16, sharing sensor data with the E-3, with assets offshore, and with a Patriot battery on the Korean Peninsula that had its own track on every Chinese fighter in the air. The J-16s, by contrast, were operating on voice command from a ground controller who couldn't see what was happening in real time. But the Chinese had a card to play that the Americans hadn't expected, and at 2:56 p.m., they played it. 240 nautical miles south, The USS Higgins, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer attached to Destroyer Squadron 15, was conducting routine transit operations through the southern Yellow Sea on her way back to her forward base. Her air search radar, the AN-SPY-1D, a system designed to track inbound ballistic missile reentry vehicles at hundreds of miles, detected something suspicious. Two Type O-52D destroyers, hull numbers later identified as the Xining and the Urumqi, had broken from their normal patrol stations off Qingdao and were running at 31 knots on a heading that would put them between the Higgins and her open ocean to the south. Behind them, 25 nautical miles further back, the radar started painting a third contact. A larger displacement signature, almost certainly the Type O-55 cruiser Yan'an, the kind of ship Chinese state media calls a 10,000-ton great destroyer. The Higgins' tactical action officer ran the math the way every American TAO has run the math since the Cold War. 3 Chinese surface combatants, closing speed about 50 knots, range to the YJ-18 anti-ship missile envelope, 18 minutes. Range from the Higgins' SM-6 surface-to-surface engagement envelope. She was already inside it, and had been since the moment those Chinese ships left port that morning. At 3:01 p.m., the captain of the Higgins did 3 things in the span of about 30 seconds. He brought the ship to general quarters. He set the Aegis combat system to weapons-tight, condition 1. And he called 7th Fleet to let them know that the People's Liberation Army Navy had apparently decided to coordinate a multi-axis demonstration of resolve, and that he was about to demonstrate some resolve right back. The picture coming together at Pacific Fleet headquarters was now genuinely interesting. Chinese forces were attempting to envelope an American destroyer from the north, while simultaneously trying to chase American fighters out of contested airspace 80 miles away. It was the kind of coordinated peacetime escalation that the PLA had spent the last decade rehearsing in war games, and the kind that the United States Navy had spent the last 70 years figuring out how to break. The break came from above. At 3:07 p.m., the E-3 Sentry handed control of the air picture to the carrier USS George Washington, which had been operating 200 miles east precisely because nobody had yet been stupid enough to do anything that would require her to be involved. Now somebody had. Carrier Air Wing 5 launched 4 F-35C Lightning IIs from VFA 147, the Argonauts, with a tanker chasing them west. The arrival of 5th-generation aircraft in the engagement zone changed the math in a way the Chinese could feel but couldn't see. The F-35's APG-81 radar started painting J-16s, while the F-35s themselves remained invisible. Radar cross-section measured in the same units used to weigh sand grains. Chinese pilots received tone warnings that they were being tracked, but couldn't see anything tracking them. By 3:18 p.m., the Chinese formation in the air was starting to come apart. Not because anyone had fired anything. Nobody had, and nobody would. But the J-16 pilots were burning fuel faster than they'd planned. The ground controllers in Shenyang were getting confused signals from radars that suddenly had ghost contacts where they shouldn't, and the senior officers somewhere up the PLAAF chain of command had started to do the math on what would happen if anyone made a mistake. The math was unfavorable. In the air, 16 J-16 versus 10 F-16 plus 4 F-35 plus an E-3 plus whatever the carrier could spool up in the next 40 minutes. Call it a 4-to-1 disadvantage in real combat power once you adjusted for sensor reach. On the surface, 3 Chinese ships versus the Higgins and whatever her sister ships in the 7th Fleet could vector north. And they could vector a lot because the Yellow Sea is shallow, but the Pacific isn't. And under the surface, well, the Chinese commanders couldn't be sure what was under the surface, which is exactly how the United States Navy likes it. The closest the situation came to going kinetic happened at 3:24 p.m., when the lead Type O-52D, the Xining, illuminated the Higgins with her Type 346A phased array radar in fire control mode. In naval grammar, this is one breath away from launching missiles, the electromagnetic equivalent of pointing a loaded gun at someone. Inside the Higgins' Combat Information Center, the Aegis system automatically generated firing solutions on all 3 Chinese ships in roughly the time it takes a human to blink. The captain held weapons tight. American discipline, drilled through countless exercises, held firm.
The Chinese illumination persisted for exactly 28 seconds, long enough to claim, in a Beijing press conference later, that they had successfully tracked a foreign warship operating provocatively in their near seas, not long enough to trigger American self-defense measures. It was choreographed aggression, but against a target that had been documenting every emission, every bearing, every signal characteristic since the moment those Chinese ships had cleared the breakwater at Qingdao that morning. At 3:31 p.m., the Chinese forces did the only thing that made sense. They started peeling away. The J-16s broke contact in pairs, heading back toward Anshan with bingo fuel calls that came earlier than their commanders had planned for. The Type 52Ds turned hard to the north, opening the geometry on the Higgins. The whole engagement, from the first Chinese scramble to the last Chinese contact heading back across the median line, had lasted about an hour and 40 minutes. No shots had been fired, no one had been hurt, but every electronic emission, every radar lock, every transponder squawk had been recorded by an MQ-4C Triton drone that had been overhead the whole time without anyone on the Chinese side knowing it was there, and by a Virginia-class submarine somewhere in water shallow enough that her presence would have been a surprise. Then came the diplomatic part, which is where the Chinese had genuinely overplayed their hand. South Korea's Ministry of National Defense was not amused. Defense Minister An Gyu-bak called General Xavier Brunson, the four-star running U.S. Forces Korea, on a secure line that evening, and asked politely, because that's how Korean defense ministers ask, what exactly the 35th Fighter Squadron had been doing with 10 airframes in the most sensitive airspace on the peninsula on a Wednesday afternoon, when nobody had told the Korean Joint Chiefs anything was happening. The chairman of the South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Jin Yong-sung, made the same call about an hour later. The Yonhap news agency had the story by Saturday morning, with unnamed military sources describing the incident as a brief standoff, Korean for, everyone almost did something stupid but didn't, this time. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, for its part, issued a statement so vaguely worded that translators in 3 different countries spent the weekend arguing about what it actually said, but the gist was that China had defended its sovereign airspace from foreign provocations, and the United States was destabilizing the region. The United States Pacific Air Forces, asked to comment, said the 35th Fighter Squadron had been conducting routine training in international airspace consistent with international law. Pacific Fleet, asked to comment on the Higgins, declined to comment specifically on the Higgins. A regional defense analyst, speaking to Stars and Stripes a few days later, put the whole thing in context that has aged better than most. For years, tensions in the region were dominated by incidents at sea. More recently, there had been a marked increase in naval-to-air and air-to-air encounters. The episode over the Yellow Sea reflected that evolution. What the analyst was too polite to say is what the Chinese commanders involved in the engagement now know, and what every senior officer in the PLA who watched the after-action telemetry has now seen with their own eyes. The Chinese military spent the last 20 years building a force optimized for one specific scenario: pushing the United States Navy out of the first island chain by overwhelming local sensors and saturating local defenses. What happened on February 18th wasn't that scenario. It was a routine training day for 10 American pilots and 1 American destroyer, and the Chinese response to it had cost more fuel, more flight hours, and more political capital than the entire week's deployment of every American asset put together. The Yellow Sea is still there. The 35th Fighter Squadron is still flying out of Kunsan. The USS Higgins finished her transit and made it back to her forward base without further incident. The Chinese ships went home. The Chinese pilots got debriefed, and somewhere in a windowless conference room in Shenyang, a duty officer is presumably still explaining to his colonel why he scrambled 16 fighters to intercept what turned out to be a basic combat maneuver drill. The freedom of navigation that lets 10 American jets train over an inland sea most Americans couldn't find on a map didn't change on February 18th. It hasn't changed since 1946, and it won't change the next time some commander in Northern Theater Command decides that international airspace looks like an opportunity worth testing. Because that's the part of the deal the Chinese leadership keeps trying to renegotiate, and the United States military keeps reminding them, politely and without firing a shot, that it is not for renegotiation.